Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Salem, Vice President for Policy and Research here at the Middle East Center. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this event today offered by the Middle East Institute's Center for Turkish Studies, headed by Dr. Gönül Tol. With President Erdogan having paid his first visit to the Trump White House yesterday, an examination of how the U.S. Turkish relationship stands and where it can go is especially timely. Our panel will specifically address the areas of cooperation and dissent between Ankara and Washington with regard to Syria, Iraq, and the Kurdish issue. And with such authoritative analysts of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, the discussion will no doubt range more broadly, and I certainly look forward to the insights our panel will offer. Before we begin, I would kindly ask those sitting at the end of a row to move to an interior seat and help us accommodate people as they come in. This event is being recorded and live streamed, so please silence your handheld devices, and we do encourage tweeting, and if you do so, please use hashtag #MEITurkey. I'd like to use this opportunity as well to encourage you to attend upcoming programs at the Middle East Institute. This evening from 6:30 to 8 in this room, we're going to be screening 3 short films by Syrian filmmakers that offer glimpses into the lives of Syrians today. That's here at 6:30 p.m. till 8. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., we will host the release of a report from several NGOs on the value of fortified underground hospitals in Syria. And a week from today, on May 24, we will offer a midday panel on applications of the arts in peace building and reconciliation. Check mei.edu/events for details, for signing up, and all of that. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague and the moderator for today's event, Dr. Gönül Tol. Gönül is known to many of you as the founding director of MEI's Center for Turkish Studies. You can find a wealth of her writing on our website, and she's a frequent commentator in the media on Turkish and Kurdish politics and briefing of government officials and on the Hill and so on. Gönül will introduce our topic and will introduce the guest panelists and will lead the discussion, including your questions from now till about 1:30 p.m. Thanks for coming, and Gönül, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Our 4 panelists, Naz Durakoglu, will be here in a few minutes. Now, let me first welcome our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to join today's discussion, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. President Erdogan was in town to have a meeting with President Trump yesterday in the wake of Trump's decision to arm the Syrian Kurdish militia. And despite Turkey's vocal opposition to the decision, both Trump and Erdogan were cordial, but still in their remarks during the press conference, Erdogan referred to the YPG and Trump basically reassured the Turks that the U.S. would support Turkey's fight against the PKK. Despite the opposition, despite the opposition from its NATO ally, the Trump administration will move forward with its decision to work with the YPG in the Raqqa operation. So my first question, first let me introduce my panelists. To my left is Mr. Jonathan Cohen. He is he has been the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State covering Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey since August 2016. He previously served in Baghdad as a Deputy Chief of Mission between 2014 and 2016, and he served in France as acting DCM and as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs. To his left is Alan Makovsky. He is a Senior Fellow on the National Security and International Policy Team at the Center for American Progress. From 2001 to 2013, he served as a senior professional staff member on the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, where he covered the Middle East, Turkey, and other related issues. And Nick Danforth, he's a senior policy analyst for the Bipartisan Policy Center's National Security Program. prior to joining BPC in January 2016, he worked on Middle East policy issues for Concepts and Strategies and the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. So my first question is to Mr. Cohen. So where do we go from here in Turkey-U.S. relations after yesterday's meeting?
Well, I think the most important point is that the relationship between the United States and Turkey is broad and deep. The disagreement over using the Syrian Democratic Forces in the operation for Raqqa is a tactical moment. It's not impacting or changing our strategic outlook or our commitment to Turkey as an ally or our commitment to Turkey's security and well-being. We have a lot to talk about. We clearly have disagreements on that tactical piece, and we have a few other issues where we have some space between our positions. But the meeting yesterday was, number one, a great opportunity for the leaders of the two countries to establish a personal relationship. Number two, an opportunity for them to hear each other's views in great depth on the key issues, both that unite us and that we have different disagreements about. And where we go from here, we continue. We've always had a very diverse and intensive relationship with Turkey, and that will continue. The conversation about Syria is an ongoing one. As you know, we've been working closely with Turkey on other aspects of trying to get the Syrian civil war to a close, to reduce violence, to find ways to get humanitarian assistance to affected populations, to work with the other powers involved at bringing about a political transition in Syria. So all of that work continues. And in fact, the conversation about the YPG in particular will also continue, because we want, as we go forward, we want to do this in a way that fully takes into account Turkey's national security interests.
Well, you in a way answered my question, because when you talk about how the U.S. partnership with the YPG is a tactical one, because a key Turkish concern has been the U.S. partnership with the YPG is not just transactional, but it will go beyond the fight against the Islamic State, and it will enable an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria, and Turkey sees that as a direct national security threat. But you're saying that's not the case, it's just a transactional partnership.
That's right.
So the YPG will not have a role in the broader strategy, U.S.'s broader Syria strategy.
The United States views our battlefield partnership with the YPG as one that is driven by necessity on the battlefield, because they are the only force that's in that part of Syria, partnered together with the Syrian components of the Syrian Democratic Forces, that is capable of moving in the near term to seize and liberate Raqqa. And our relationship is temporary, transactional, and tactical.
But they are, on the other hand, they're local actors. So if we talk about stabilization of the country, or a transition process, or a post-transition process, they will be there. So
well, they're there anyway.
Okay.
And the question isn't, the question isn't, can you exclude the Syrian Kurds who are members of the YPG from the future of Syria? The question is, can you build a Syria that includes all of the voices, pro and anti, the various factions that are on the ground there, so that the people of Syria actually have a say in choosing their own future? And that's no one has the answer on how we get there yet, but that's what I think we're all working toward.
Well, what we heard both from Trump and Erdogan yesterday was this, as you just mentioned, that the relationship is very strong. They're close NATO allies and will keep working together. But yes, the YPG has strained relations under the Obama administration, and it will continue to do so. So the question is, if Turkey decides to retaliate or respond by closing Incirlik Air Base, for instance, or taking a unilateral military action in northern Syria, where U.S. special forces are based, how would the U.S. respond?
Well, we had an incident of that in April, and we urged Turkey, when it feels it needs to take action, to coordinate with the coalition and with us, with all the partners who have forces on the ground. and when Turkey feels it needs to take action in Iraq to coordinate with the government of Iraq as well.
Well, Alan, I would like to ask you, you've been following Turkey for a long time, so how do you think, what would be the next step for the Turkish government? Because Erdogan was he used very strong words before coming to Washington, and I think in an effort to strengthen his hand, he met with Putin 2 times in 11 days, and he had a visit to China. So I think that was his effort to show that he had other options, and he's been in talks with Russia on purchasing Russian defense systems. So these were all efforts, and I think Turkey was trying to signal to the U.S. administration that there is, from the U.S. perspective, the stakes are high. So the question is, given he returned home empty-handed, can he afford not to do anything given the elections in 2019?
Well, 2019 is a long way away.
But he started working on that.
Yeah, that's true. But he has put himself out on a limb. He said before coming to Washington while he was in China, if the alliance doesn't come first, meaning if the U.S. doesn't drop its relationship with the YPG, we will have to go out on our own. And on the other hand, the announcement about the YPG took place a week before his trip. He came anyway. I think that says something about the leverage in the relationship. And so whatever he does, I don't think we're talking about something dramatic like closing Incirlik or leaving NATO. I don't think any of those things would be in Turkey's interest. I think what we're talking about is him continuing to push the envelope and showing greater foreign policy independence while staying within NATO and deriving benefits from NATO. As you mentioned, for example, flirting with the idea of buying the S-400s from Russia, the Astana process regarding Syria, which basically excludes the United States. It's a process that Turkey conducts with Russia and Iran. I thought the picture from China was at least symbolic with Xi, Putin, and Erdogan standing aligned together. I think this is the thing that I think is of most concern, that Turkey is continuing to push that envelope towards greater independence within NATO. I don't see a break, and a full break, and I don't see a closure of Incirlik.
But so he wants, do you expect Turkey to take further unilateral military action?
I think it's very possible. I would imagine in the future he would give more than 51 minutes warning or whatever the exact number was. But I think been very direct that if the U.S. continues to work with the YPG, that they won't exclude cross-border operations. And in fact, one of their advisors, I guess there's some controversy about how authorized he was, actually said, well, if U.S. soldiers get caught in the crossfire, so be it. But I don't think Turkey wants that to happen. I think there would be more warning in the future, but yeah, I do expect more cross-border operations.
So you don't foresee a change in Turkey's strategy vis-a-vis the PYD, because some would argue that given right now he has to live with the U.S. decision, and that calls for a reversal in strategy, that he might pursue a more pragmatic approach vis-a-vis the PYD. Is that possible?
I guess it's possible. It's certainly to be hoped for. Certainly, I think going into the meeting, there was conventional wisdom starting to congeal around the idea that the administration would divide the question. As you pointed out, Trump said, we'll cooperate with you against the PKK. He didn't say anything about YPG, and that the trade-off would be Turkey, stay out of our lane regarding Syria, let us do what we want regarding the YPG. We continue to operate from Incirlik. You don't do cross-border operations inside Syria. But regarding the PKK and regarding Sinjar, we're going to look the other way. And I guess it is still possible that something like that could be worked out. And that might be the best that could be hoped for. But if so, Erdogan has not yet indicated that. Now, we do have to keep in mind, these are bookend meetings. There's going to be a NATO summit at the end of the month. So this conversation between Trump and Erdogan isn't over, I don't believe. And I would doubt that major Turkish actions or decisions will be taken before that NATO summit.
So maybe Turkey stepping up its attacks on Sinjar is more likely. And is there room for cooperation between the U.S. and Turkey there? Could that be a bargaining chip in terms of Turkey is quite concerned about the PKK presence in Sinjar, thinking that the PKK use that to as a gateway to form a continuous region. So that's a major Turkish concern. And can the U.S. do something on that? Can the U.S. exert pressure on Barzani, Kurdistan Regional Government on Baghdad and the PKK and make sure to remove PKK from Sinjar? Is that possible?
I think it's possible, but very difficult. I mean, you're right, all the players you mentioned, we have a lot of influence on Barzani, on Iraq, on Baghdad, even indirectly on the PKK, at least we should have, through the YPG, be able to exert some influence, but the PKK seems very dug in, and I don't think it will be so easy for us to arrange for a voluntary departure, but some sort of cooperation, and certainly that would be desirable if it could be done. Some sort of arrangement whereby we open the gates for Turkey, I think is possible. After all, it's not in our interest either for the PKK to be in control of Sinjar. I mean, one of the things, it's a complicated issue, but one of the things I think that the U.S. is concerned about is the possibility of Iran establishing a land bridge all the way from Tehran through Iraq into Syria and, of course, to Hezbollah. And Sinjar geographically plays a very vital role in that, so I think, potentially, so I think we would also like to see the PKK out of there. Whether we can get them to do it voluntarily, it seems to me a long shot.
Yeah.
Let me jump in here. And absolutely, we'd like to see the PKK out of Sinjar. But let's be clear, the PKK does not control Sinjar. There is a PKK presence there. There is also a presence of KDP Peshmerga there. Unfortunately, 5 of the KDP Peshmerga were killed in the Turkish attack on April 25th because they're in such close proximity. But the KDP is also opposed to a PKK presence in Sinjar. And the Abadi government is opposed to a PKK presence in Sinjar. They happen to be deeply engaged in the last stages of the Mosul campaign right now. And I believe that when Mosul is finished, you'll see increased attention by both the Kurdistan Regional Government and Baghdad, together in partnership with us on trying to get the PKK out, whether that is voluntarily or otherwise.
Nick, I want to ask you about, I know that it's a very difficult question to answer, but I'll still go ahead and ask that. What do you think about Erdogan's, because all this discussion is tied to Erdogan's domestic strategy. What do you think that is? Do you think he's going to hold on to his nationalist alliance, or is an opening with the Kurds possible? And that's not a question that solely concerns domestic politics. I think if Turkey could manage to fix its problem with the Kurds and return to the negotiations with the Kurds, that would remove one of the most important problems from Turkey-U.S. relations, and it could also make things much less complicated for the U.S., for other regional powers. So that's why I think it's quite important. So what do you think? What do you think moving forward? What will he do?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. Thankfully, you all have begun answering it with your comments. I would say based on, well, the outcome of the referendum last month, now the clear U.S. decision to stick with arming the YPG, it really highlights the starkness of the dilemma that Erdogan, that the AKP face in their domestic politics. Namely that over the last 2 years, the various strategies they've pursued, political, military, diplomatic, to try to combat the PKK and the Kurdish nationalist movement more broadly, have not been completely unsuccessful, but they've failed to give Erdogan, they failed to give the Turkish government the kind of decisive victory they wanted, or even the leverage to return to negotiations, I think, on terms that would be acceptable to the Turkish government's new nationalist constituency. I think that makes the situation very difficult for them going forward. Militarily in southeastern Turkey, they've shown that they can prevent the PKK's urban affiliates from holding territory in Turkish cities. They've done that at a great humanitarian cost, but they've also shown, I think the referendum results show this, that they can do that, they can fight these battles, they can win, while still maintaining what's long been the Turkish government's conservative Kurdish constituency in the southeast. At the same time, despite these tactical military victories, they've been unable to prevent the PKK from continuing to carry out a guerrilla war against the Turkish military. And they've also, while maintaining their own Kurdish constituency, the referendum results also show they've failed to eat into what's the long-standing and very strong constituency that the PKK, the HDP, the Kurdish nationalist movement more broadly, maintains in the southeast. Similarly in Syria, I think that Euphrates Shield operation, the Turkish capture of al-Bab, at some level that succeeded in preventing the YPG from uniting its cantons, from creating a unified Rojava statelet on Turkey's borders. At the same time, in the broader diplomatic situation, Turkey has been singularly unsuccessful. They've been unable to prevent the YPG from emerging, from creating a de facto Kurdish statelet that now enjoys good relations with the United States and with Russia. So I think Turkish policy might be able to curtail some of the YPG's gains, working out a diplomatic agreement with the United States to prevent them from holding Raqqa after its conquest, maybe getting U.S. support for an operation in Sinjar, but this won't change the fundamental reality of a Kurdish statelet. And so I think what seems frightening to me is that given this reality, given the limitations of Turkish strategy, we're now at a situation where maybe the best that can be hoped for is a maintenance of the status quo, a continuation of low-level fighting in southeastern Turkey, continued political maneuvering in northern Syria aimed at increasing both sides' bargaining position. At the end of the day, neither side seems prepared to go back to negotiations. And both sides seem capable of enduring a kind of continuation of the status quo while they look towards, maybe a change in strategic realities that will give them a leverage going forward. Set against this, the worst case scenario is that either side could decide that it would serve its interest to escalate. As people have said, given the repeated and very strong language Turkey has used threatening a full-scale military operation against Rojava, I don't think they would have used this language if they were purely bluffing, if there weren't some red lines that they feel like would lead them to take full-fledged military operations in Syria. The PKK, for its part, since I think last December, has refrained from carrying out the kind of high-profile terrorist attacks in Western Turkish cities that have killed civilians. If they were to go back to doing this, I hope that would be a red line for U.S. support for the YPG. I have no idea if it would be, but that would push the situation in a very dangerous direction. So I guess in conclusion, while I know, myself and Alan with the Bipartisan Policy Center, you more eloquently for the New York Times, we've all called for the United States to push Turkey and the PKK back to the negotiating table. That seems like a wonderful goal. If that proves impossible, at the very least, I hope the United States can keep both sides from escalating this conflict with potentially disastrous consequences.
Well, you said do you really think that the status quo is sustainable given, Erdogan has an agenda for 2019 now. He declared that next year is going to be the year of investment. So he's going to, he's clearly very concerned about Turkey's international image and the economic situation. So this country, his country that increasingly looks like a chaotic place is certainly not good for foreign direct investment and for the vision that he has in mind for 2019. So that means that he can't afford further PKK violence or clashes. So do you think that he believes the status quo is sustainable? Because some, just recently, yesterday I was reading a columnist who is known to be very close to Erdogan, and he thinks that moving forward, I think he'll strike a more moderate tone, and he'll try to appeal to the center, and that includes the Kurds, because there is an understanding that the status quo is not sustainable. And also from the PKK's point of view, I think for them, what's happening in Turkey is a sideshow. The real thing is happening in northern Syria, and that's why for them being in a conflict with the Turkish state is also not a great idea. So.
I mean, that's what strikes me as so discouraging about this, and why, I use the word dilemma in the full meaning of the word. I feel like since this conflict reemerged in the summer of 2015, I've read, repeatedly Turkish pro-government columnists basically talking about why this was unsustainable, talking about why this was going to do great damage to Turkey's economy, to Turkey's domestic stability, to Turkey's international image. As you say, right, clearly people realize that this is at odds with the long-term vision that Erdogan has for a stable, powerful, prosperous Turkey. But when the alternative seems even more politically unsustainable, and the government doesn't feel like it has a choice, that's when I worry they'd pursue this policy. I was struck, I guess, several months before the referendum. You certainly do have this narrative in Washington that Erdogan benefits from instability, benefits from the war with the PKK. And at some point, the government issued very clear orders to Turkish newspapers to stop reporting on terrorist attacks because presumably at some level they felt like the level of instability had actually become a threat to their domestic politics. But again, I was struck that was after, I think, that was after a bombing in Western Turkey. That was after, it might have been the bombing outside of Beşiktaş Stadium. I think it's that, unfortunately, level of terrorist attack, again, in major cities, killing large numbers of Turkish civilians. That's what the government sees as the political risk, and if they can create a de facto or a tacit understanding with the PKK to avoid that level of escalation, they may decide this is sustainable given the alternatives.
Well, before I turn to Naz, Mr. Cohen, my last question for you, is there an understanding within the new U.S. administration that Turkey's Kurdish question is not confined to domestic politics anymore? And if Turkey fails to return to the negotiations, it won't be an effective partner in the fight against ISIS. And if there is one, is there pressure from the White House on the Turkish government to resume the peace talks with the PKK?
It's a long question. Let me start with the ISIS piece. It was clear in the conversations yesterday that both Turkey and the United States are 100% committed to the fight against ISIS until ISIS is pushed out of Iraq and Syria. And then the fight will continue wherever else they may be. We are absolutely committed, as are the Turks, to fighting terrorism in all of its forms, principally ISIS and the PKK. And we stand side by side on that. As far as the calculation of when the Turkish government, how the Turkish government gets back to the negotiating table with the PKK, that's a question for the Turks. It's clearly a piece of how you get to a solution to the problems of Southeast Turkey. Is it new that it's gone beyond Turkey's borders? I don't think that's new. the Turks have been pursuing PKK operations, counter-PKK operations in northern Iraq for many, many years.
But in terms of U.S. interests are concerned, I mean...
Well, and U.S. interests were concerned then as well when we were conducting no-fly zone operations, and we had people on the ground in northern Iraq, and we needed to, and our position through all those years was that Turkish operations in the name of pursuing terrorists needed to be limited in scope and duration and scrupulous to avoid civilian casualties. That was a policy for many, many years. We haven't articulated any kind of linkage yet. So that's what I can tell you.
I mean, historically, for many years, the U.S., I think, has never had a real Kurdish policy, never seen the Kurdish issue as a matter of democratization and human rights, and usually did not really touch Turkey's, what Turkey does with its own Kurds domestically. But now, this administration has defined its number one goal in Syria as defeating the Islamic State. So that is, that's really directly tied to what Turkey does to its own Kurds. So that's why my question was, is there
I don't
any
think so.
pressure
I don't think what we do in fighting ISIS has anything to do with Turkey's Kurds. It has to do right now with the Kurdish militia in Syria that is helping us to drive ISIS out of the Raqqa area. But I don't think it's a domestic Turkish issue, except in that there is an institutional link between the YPG and the PKK.
But don't you think Turks would be less concerned about the YPG and would be more cooperative if Turkey did not have an ongoing conflict with the PKK domestically?
Of course.
So
Of course,
it's linked.
but yes, it's not direct though.
Okay.
You can't solve the PKK problem in Turkey by eliminating the YPG issue in Syria.
Well, Naz, welcome.
Thank you.
My question for you, you've been working on Turkey and Russia, and I want to ask a question about that. Turkey, right before you came, we were talking about how Turkey has been using the Russia card. And Turkey and Russia, they've been in talks about purchasing S-400, and of course that sparked a concern among Turkey's NATO allies. And Turkey has been wanting to not just purchase missile defense system, but also technology transfer as well. And now the Turkish officials are implying that Russians are more than willing to sell S-400, and they're also willing to share technology. But military experts say it might not be that easy. What is your take on that? How serious is Turkey with this deal, given its already complicated relationship with its Western partners? Will Turkey take that step, or are we going to see the same thing happening to the Russia deal as we saw with the Chinese system? And also, how serious are Russians about technology sharing?
Well, thank you, Gönül, and I apologize for arriving late today. So in terms of the S-400 question, it is an interesting question, but as you alluded to with the Chinese situation back from 2013, we've kind of been down this road a little bit before with Turkey. Turkey has long sought an air defense system of its own. Right now it's operating with NATO deployed assets, and as you mentioned, technology transfer is a big part of what they're looking at in terms of any deal. They have looked at U.S. systems, European systems, and where the U.S. systems and European systems kind of don't fit the bar for Turkey, according to Turkish officials, is this technology transfer issue and, of course, the price. So in the past, China has come in to save the day on this, and now it's Russia that's being discussed. In terms of the possibilities, I think, you had the Turkish defense minister just about a month or so ago say that they're in the final stages of doing this, and then on May 3rd, Putin and Erdogan met in Sochi, and they said that they're coming out with a broad plan to get this sale going. But I personally don't think this is going to really work out for both sides that well, and I think both sides are well aware of this too. One of the main reasons is for Turkey, it's not just a matter of course, there's a political question with Turkey being a NATO ally and having a completely interoperable system. This is not, this S-400 system is obviously not going to be integrated into the NATO, into any of the NATO assets that exist in Turkey. So this is a huge problem if you're talking about air defense, because that's a command and control issue that, you know, technically that's not really going to work out. And then on the Russian side, yes, this is their new system. Actually, the lab that I'm associated with, Digital Forensic Research Lab, just did kind of a piece on the S-400 system. Only 2 other foreign nations have purchased it, China, India, and right now it's also deployed in Kaliningrad, Syria, throughout some other Russian areas. Turkey would really stand out as a NATO ally if it had this. And the reason why, for the Russians, it might be good PR, it might be a good way to poke at the West and at NATO, and there's a lot of debate about how it also might benefit Russia in that somehow the Kremlin can kind of gain NATO information through having the system there. But in reality, there are Russian systems in other NATO countries, not the S-400 system. And what ends up happening is it ends up being more of a problem for the Russians because the NATO countries that have the other older systems, they'll actually incorporate those systems into NATO exercises and tests. So it's not a positive thing for Moscow to have that happen for their newest, shiniest toy. And so I think ultimately, for technical reasons, this probably won't work out. But beyond that, I think, you know, the political pressure is probably huge. And of course, the Russia-Turkey question, I think, is one of the overall bilateral situations, one of the most fascinating, I think, questions that's out there. And if you really if you look at their rhetoric, yes, there's a lot of warming, particularly after, you know, they had some tense relations after the November 2015 shoot down of the Russian plane in Syria that actually impeded Turkish airspace. But when you look on the ground in Syria, there are really divergent views there, and it seems like these two friends are probably going to hit a wall at some point. So I don't think the bromance as a whole is going to last for very long. So I think the S-400, including a couple of their other joint projects, this joint wealth fund that they're trying to do, the second pipeline for Turkstream, I think a lot of these projects are going to be in the discussion phases for a long time.
And can the U.S., you think, match the Russian offer with Patriots?
Well,
because that's been a long time.
That's been, yeah. So that's actually been that question has been open for so long. I mean, since I was on the Hill and then at State, and I mean, I feel like this is just going to keep going.
And it was part of the discussion yesterday.
Yeah, from what I heard too. And so I would say, so it's a different situation. I mean, the Patriot system. It's far more expensive. The technology transfer is not really an option to the extent that the Turks would like it to be. And of course, there are a couple of regulatory issues on the U.S. side that don't really exist for obviously the Russian and any other, the Chinese system. And the Europeans have kind of offered a little bit more too, but that doesn't meet Turkey's standards. Ultimately, Turkey's really interested in developing their own, defense industry, and this is something that's really important to them. So there will need to be some sort of agreement if Patriot is going to be back on the table. But I think in an ideal world, if they could do it, the Turks really want to develop their own system, which is something that they said they would do, which is why they, turned the page on the Chinese system. But these are difficult things. You can't just think up the technology. So someone is going to have to help them with that, and obviously the U.S. is well placed to do that, but there are issues on our side too that are mainly regulatory, and there's some sensitivities there.
And my last question to the panel, and anyone can jump in, what assurances can the U.S. offer to Turkey? There's this debate on Manbij, and what the U.S. can offer. Manbij is a Syrian town that's held by the YPG, and initially when the YPG captured Manbij from the Islamic State, of course Turkey was quite furious and said that it received assurances from the U.S. administration that once the operation was over, the YPG would withdraw, and that never happened. So now there is this new debate about that. What do you think about that? Could that be on the table? Is that realistic? And if not, what other assurances can the U.S. Offer to Turkey so that to ease the tension?
Well, as I understand it, currently in Manbij, there is still a YPG presence, but the town is run by an Arab-dominated consul that the Turks see as basically under the YPG's thumb. Perhaps the question should be directed to Jonathan. Sorry to do that, but
Happy to have you take it.
yeah. But it does seem to me that there should be some room for bargaining about the composition of the controlling forces in Manbij to come up with a consul that perhaps is more amenable to what Turkey wants to see. So I would think there would be some possibility for that, and particularly if the U.S. does come to an understanding with Turkey in which the YPG is assured that there will not be further cross-border operations. It should be a trade-off that the YPG would be willing to make. But I don't know.
Well, let me come back to where I started. We're in continuing conversations with Turkey about the future of politics in northern Syria. What happens the day after Raqqa, for instance, is liberated? And the experience with Manbij was one where we had made commitments to Turkey that in the end were not fully realized. And we need to do better in the next step, which is Raqqa. The challenge with Manbij was that the YPG-led forces liberated the city, and we had made a commitment that once the city was liberated, the YPG forces would get out of the city and stay east of the Euphrates. The part that we didn't build into that commitment was before they leave the city, they have to train a hold force, or ISIL just comes right back in. So they were kept there to train the hold force, and the Turks complained, you promised they would leave, and they're still there. And then the military units left, but the political advisors stayed. And the Turks complained again and said, well, fine, the military guys are gone, but they still have operatives there, and you said they would be gone. And we said, yeah, the military guys are gone. So again, what this gets to is having some kind of common vision about the political future of the area once the military piece is over.
Jonathan, could I just ask to clarify? I know Manbij was a majority Arab town, which of course is one of the points the Turks make. But I think there was quite a sizable Kurdish population there before too, right?
Well, it was
something
a
like
small,
25-30%.
It was a minority, but not an inconsequential one.
Right.
Raqqa is almost 100% Arab. So
Right.
there should be no room for that in Raqqa. And the concept that we've been working on, that we've been talking to the Turks about for Raqqa, is an entirely Arab-run city council. So there are other pieces of this conversation, how stabilization goes forward, how humanitarian assistance gets provided, how you go about getting the displaced population which fled the area when the fighting started back home, and who channels those activities, who is in charge of them, because whoever is in charge of them ends up establishing a kind of political legitimacy for the future. And the Turkish point, which we take on board, is that the people doing that facilitation should not be the YPG. And with that, we agree.
I could just make a quick comment, and this was alluded to earlier, but I think all of these discussions, they're very short-term discussions, because ultimately a lot of it is, treating the symptoms without treating the disease of what do you actually do about the Kurdish question. And again, that's to reiterate what a lot of the panel was saying earlier. That is why there should be more of a push to getting Turkey back to the negotiating table with the PKK to ease their concerns, which now have extended far beyond Turkish borders, because that's why we're running into this issue of which council should be controlled by what, because it's kind of focused to that granularity, when I think there is a larger picture question here of what to ultimately do when things can, I don't think it has to be necessarily that black and white.
Was there pressure under the Obama administration on Turkey and the PKK to resume the talks?
I mean, Jonathan would actually have more to say about that.
Sorry, I've been trying to avoid.
Naz was working in Washington while I was overseas
Yes.
in Baghdad, so
Right.
she saw this. She saw this when the talks were actually going
Yeah.
on. I came in after they had broken down.
But I would say, I mean, there was actually a lot of discussion because I think, keep in mind, I was at State Department for 2 years, so there may have been conversations that obviously preceded me, but it was very eye-opening to see how to resolve the Kurdish question was a part of the discussion and how to actually get to a place where you recognized all the elements in a way that made sense for both U.S. interests and Turkey as well. And I think throughout the conversations, what struck me, again, my personal view, is the sensitivity toward Turkish concerns. Sometimes I felt that the Turkish concerns were a little inflated, but at the same time, you know, it's definitely, you're constantly watching the U.S. do this balancing act, and it's definitely difficult, and at some point there needs to be kind of a push in a certain direction. Otherwise, there's always going to be these elements of, okay, well, we have to make sure the YPG here is not doing this, and the PKK here, we have to do that. It's complicated. And of course, you know, it's not just the Turkey-U.S. dynamic that complicates this. The Kurds within one another also are very segmented.
And there's an important dynamic that has to do with timing. Remember that there was a coup attempt in July, and Turkish society and Turkish politics have been reeling and are just getting their footing back. So my personal view is that I don't think President Erdogan and his team were ready after the coup attempt to try and get back to the table until they got their feet more solidly under themselves and felt like they'd turned the page on the coup attempt chapter. I don't know that we're there yet. I hope we are, and if we're not, I hope we get there soon. But I think that's part of the dynamic as well.
Nick, if you don't have anything to add, I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So please state your names and try to be brief. Please, there is one question, and let's take 3 at a time. And Namo and the lady here.
Thanks very much. I'm Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and I'll monitor. Question for Mr. Cohen. Human rights in Turkey, the arrests of so many journalists and others, did that come up at all in the discussions between President Trump and President Erdogan? And also I'd be curious about your reaction to the incident that took place outside the Turkish ambassador's residence where I think 9 people were injured and 2 were arrested in a horrible scuffle between Erdogan's bodyguards and protesters. We had something similar the last time Erdogan came, but I think this was even worse. Thanks.
Okay, let's take another question.
Thank you, Gönül, for this great panel. I'm Namo Abdullah with Rudao. I have one question for Mr. Cohen. You said that your military partnership with the YPG is temporary and transactional. But as you know, military might is largely what's going to define who can call the shots in Syria in the days to come. So my question, within an unintended consequence of your military support for the YPG, be the creation of a Kurdish autonomous zone. This is pretty much what happened in Iraq after the US invasion. Thank you.
And one final question to the lady here. Please.
Laurie Milroy, Kurdistan 24, and my question follows on from the previous one. First is, do the panelists all agree with Mr. Cohen's statement that the U.S. alliance with the YPG is tactical and temporary and transactional? And 2, are you aware that many Kurds expect that the YPG will get something out of having sacrificed so much in fighting ISIS with the United States?
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. Let me start with the last question. We have not promised the YPG anything. They are in this fight because they want to be in this fight. They have clearly their own motivations as well, but we're in a common fight to defeat a terrorist organization that has wreaked havoc on Iraq and Syria, that tries to reach out into Europe and the United States and Turkey, that kills innocent civilians, that beheads people on social media for its propaganda purposes. the ugliness of that organization and what it's done is what has put it at the top of our foreign policy agenda. And that is why we have the partnership we have with the YPG, because they are the force that was on the ground, that was ready to act in short term, and that we felt could be effective in this. And that's where it stops. On the question of unintended consequences, our position right now, our policy is not to support any kind of autonomous ethnic or sectarian zones in Syria. If that's not our intention. I can't speculate as to what the ultimate development will be. But our intention is to have the people of the areas decide their own governance in the future. And on the violence that took place in front of the ambassador's residence in the embassy last night, we strongly condemn violence. We strongly support the right of people to peacefully protest. And people need to be willing to hear voices that they sometimes disagree with, but there is no place in our country for violence in either direction. On the human rights question, I'm not aware that it came up yesterday, but we repeatedly and often and will continue to make the point that we care about the quality of Turkish democracy. We think that a strong and healthy Turkish democracy is good for the country, it's good for the alliance, it's good for Turks. That includes freedom of the press, the rule of law, and independent judiciary, and those are all things that we hope and urge the Turks to abide by.
On actually, to follow up on the human rights issue, I feel like I have a little bit more freedom to speak here. I think that this has been obviously an ongoing issue that the State Department, as well as the White House, has had to tackle with Turkey. The backsliding is not positive. It's definitely getting in the way of a number of joint ventures and different things. And I think one thing that needs to really be recognized, and this follows up on even the Russia question earlier, the more Turkey goes in the direction away from its democratic values, away from honoring freedom of speech and these types of issues, the closer it gets to countries like Russia and Iran. There becomes almost a natural synergy there. So it is 100% in the interest of the United States to pursue human rights issues within Turkey. That being said, having been at the State Department, I think there is also a strong debate on how to address those issues. Sometimes it's not always the best to put out a statement and say, this was bad for X and Y reason, and what ends up happening is the debate becomes about that statement for weeks instead of actually addressing the issues. So there are a number of conversations, and I wouldn't even say they're necessarily behind the scenes, they're just more quiet. They're diplomatic conversations, and I feel like the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, as well as the State Department here, have been pursuing those, and a number of Turkish journalists actually who were once in jail, who aren't necessarily in the best of positions right now, but they'll even say that a lot of the diplomacy on behalf of the U.S. was what led to their release. So I just wanted to kind of be clear about that. It's a very complicated question, but I also just want to address what happened in front of the Turkish residents. That's actually why I'm late today. And there is, so that it's despicable, and this has happened the second time. It happens all around the world with Erdogan's security detail. The videos clearly depict that these were Erdogan's security detail going after protesters. Yes, they were egged on, but that doesn't matter. That's not what they're here for. And these individuals have diplomatic immunity. And just as they're granted diplomatic immunity, they can also, that diplomatic immunity can be revoked by the State Department. And the fact that this is the second time that this is occurring, I actually looked at some of the tapes from Brookings. There are repeat offenders here. This needs to be something that the State Department actually looks at to make sure that these individuals, this isn't speaking to Erdogan or who, this is speaking to those individuals that carried out that violence on U.S. soil, that they cannot have diplomatic immunity in return here. This is a serious issue.
Alan, you have something?
Yeah. I wanted to address Laurie's very important question about whether the relationship with the YPG should be seen as merely tactical and transactional, and I think implied in that time limited. Once Raqqa is conquered, once ISIS is defeated, we're done with the YPG. I don't think that's really a realistic approach. Particularly, it's in effect asking people to give their lives for a cause that I think they themselves are only investing in for the sake of a future relationship with the United States. I don't think the YPG was in and of itself eager to undertake the Raqqa operation, from what I understand. So I think there should be, and the outlines of this should be discussed now. There should be some expectation of a future relationship, but there should also be clear conditions on it. And I think the YPG really has to cut its ties with the PKK and stop the veneration of Abdullah Öcalan that is so visible and also in their educational system. That Turkey will never be comfortable with them on their border as long as that's the case. I think they also have to be prepared to be far more inclusive, to bring in not only non-Kurdish and non-Muslim elements. They have brought some in. We have some representatives of some of the groups they've brought in, actually here today, I see in the audience. But they have to be willing to bring in non-PYD
Anti-Öcalanist.
Anti-Öcalanist Kurds, exactly. And I think that really has to be, along with an understanding that will ultimately have to be sold to Turkey, that yes, there will be some sort of entity in the north that will be Kurdish dominated and will have a certain degree of autonomy. I do think those things have to be worked out now. It's I think a little far-fetched to expect that the YPG would sign on to the idea that there cannot be any further relationship after this. So, I'd also really like to underscore, as having been a very direct witness at Brookings to the security riot that went on, I'd really like to underscore what Naz said. I think those people at Brookings should not have been admitted a second time. I mean, it was, I mean, as a matter of fact, I feel guilty myself that I should have reported some of the names that I got when I was at Brookings. I'm shocked that they were not excluded, and those repeat offenders and any other offenders, maybe non-repeat offenders, must be excluded from future visits to the United States, with or without President Erdogan.
Nick?
I would only add, to take a slightly different tack from Alan, that I think the U.S. relationship historically with other Kurdish actors over the last half century is such that even if we were to reassure the YPG that our relationship was not just tactical, even if we were to reassure them that we'd never abandon them after we fulfilled our shared interests, they might be savvy enough to have some skepticism about those claims.
Yes. The gentleman here on the second row and the first row.
Hello, my name is Ragip Soylu with Turkish newspaper Daily Sabah. Of course, we are a bunch of journalists here, and my question will be addressed to Mr. Cohen as well. You know, if you now find an American official in a room nowadays, you just don't miss him. The Pentagon readout on the meeting between Secretary Mattis and the Turkish Defense Minister Işık mentioned specifically a plan to increase cooperation on Turkey's counter-PKK efforts. And I expect that Mr. Cohen should be informed about this plan. What is this plan?
I'm going to have to refer you to the Pentagon.
Well, expected response. The second question, you said, no, let me change my question. There was a statement by President Trump yesterday during the joint statement by President Erdogan and Trump himself said that Turkish president asked some weapons to be delivered to Turkey from United States. What are those weapons exactly?
Again, on military technical questions, I need to refer you to the Pentagon.
Okay.
I just don't want to get it. I don't want to get it partially right. So you should have the accurate thing.
Thank Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to the panel for a very stimulating discussion. Two-part question. First of all, in the discussions, what about the Russian, Turkish, Iranian peace plan? To what degree you understand that was discussed, particularly protection of the safe zones? And secondly, and this gets to the heart of several of the issues, after the coup and after the decimation of some of the leadership of the Turkish army, is the Turkish army really capable of going after the Kurds in Syria or not? Or is this just empty boasting by the Turkish government?
And here, Robert.
I thank you for the panel. My name is Robert Ozgun. I'm representing American Syriac Union. My question is somehow related to other Robert that he addressed. My question is to Ms. Durakoglu. Usually now we see U.S. and Russia competition in Middle East. Just I wanted to know your ideas how this competition will change or will shape the future of Middle East. Like now Turkey, you talked about S-400s, and from the other side, they want to give another deal, or when we see YPG and Turkey in both sides, when America is going close to Turkey, then Russia is saying to YPG, we are ready for you, we will help you. At the other side, when U.S. is going close to Turkey, then Russia is saying, okay, we are ready to help you. Do you think today, like the Kurds and the Turks are close to U.S. Do you think in the future one of those figures will go with Russia?
Thank you. I could just start off with your question. I think it's an important question, and it definitely has a lot of insight into actually what's going on. Again, my opinion is that there was a vacuum that was left that started under the Obama administration in Syria that the Russians are now handily filling. We're seeing steps in the current administration to potentially take more of a role. You saw the response after the chemical attack recently. And then even the Raqqa operation, the planning for it is something that is a little bit different. But I think you're right. There is going to be this back and forth continually between U.S. Russia. I don't think it's the U.S. and I don't believe that this was the case even during the Obama administration. I don't even think it's the case now that the U.S. is necessarily looking at Russia as a force to counter and just trying to play this, big power game. I think they're just trying to figure out their own strategy right now. Raqqa is the main, the main objective, but we're not sure what's going to happen after that. But I think Russia really does see the situation in Syria and the Middle East as a whole, because you're also seeing them now involved in other vacuums in Libya, other places too. And so I think that Russia does wherever there's a vacuum, and these are strategically important areas, they are going to go to fill it. So this actually goes to the importance of, in my opinion, U.S. leadership in these areas, even when at times it's difficult and when the international community is not happy with it. But the reason why we even got to this stage is because there's also a very different domestic debate playing out within both Russia and the United States. So the United States for a long time, particularly after Iraq, there has been more of a movement away from interventionism. That's not necessarily where the U.S. public wants to go, and rightfully the leadership is responding to that. There might be better ways of responding to it, but that's what you're seeing. But I do think that you're going to see this. And then for the YPG issue, this goes back to the earlier question too. I mean, that is interesting, because I actually don't think that it's necessarily that the YPG or the Kurds have this, historic partnership with the U.S. I mean, obviously, Russia has always been a significant player, particularly with the PKK and YPG, and so that's not necessarily discussed. I've always found it really interesting that Erdogan, before this visit, was very upset about, U.S. attempts to work with the YPG, and now arm the YPG, but the issue with the YPG interactions with Russia don't necessarily come up. And what's different about those interactions is that, and this is I think what Jonathan meant by the tactical relationship, is that all the efforts with the US and the YPG are directed against ISIS. That's where you see them work together. But with Russia and the YPG and other entities, you actually see it without ISIS. So it's definitely a broader relationship, and you see it right on the Turkish border half the time too. So the fact that, you know, Turkish leadership chooses not to necessarily, you know, discuss that.
With the PKK too.
With the PKK too, yeah. I mean, obviously, these are Marxist organizations. They have a little bit more of a, you know, tie to a certain leaning. So it is interesting to see, and I think, you know, Russia's definitely enjoying complicating that environment, but they will, wherever there's a vacuum, fill it, wherever it is. You see that everywhere.
Alan?
Yeah. I was going to defer to Jonathan, but I guess he...
I can take Astana if you want to take it.
Okay, I'll take it, Craig. Look, the only thing I would add on Russia in the Middle East is one thing that I see as a growing concern is the Russian-Iranian relationship. These two are not necessarily natural allies, given Russia's aversion to Islamic extremism, which Iran represents, albeit in the Shia form. And in fact, Russia has not been, you know, a great defender necessarily of Iran over the years. It voted for many, many Security Council resolutions regarding the Iranian nuclear program. It was a partner with the Obama administration. I mean, whatever one thinks about the nuclear agreement with Iran, everything I heard from those who were close to negotiations on our side, on the U.S. side, was that Russia was a helpful partner in those negotiations. But it seems to me through this experience in Syria, where Hezbollah, as well as other third country Shiite forces and some Iranian Rev Guard, are essentially playing the land forces for Russia's Air Force, this relationship seems to be tightening. I noticed just one example when Netanyahu, who keeps in close touch with Russia, on his last trip, there were reports, I don't know if this was accurate, that for the first time, Russia complained to him about Israeli bombing of Hezbollah convoys in Syria, which Israel has done quite a bit, mainly from Lebanese airspace. And it's something that had been understood that Russia was tolerating, mainly because it takes place far away, generally from the main Russian zone. This time, reportedly, Putin raised it as a concern. There's other evidence of a potentially tightening relationship, which I think is a concern. I just had maybe on the YPG, I did talk to one Turkish official, and it was off the record, and I think maybe it's unofficial, but I raised the issue of Russian support for the YPG, and he said he really saw it as a reaction to the U.S. support, and not as much more than that. Now, I don't think that's accurate, but I thought it was interesting that that was the attitude that was reflected. And regarding, Robert, your question on whether the Turkish military is capable after the convulsions of the coup, and again, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I am aware, at least publicly, Turkey is not offering to send major forces to Raqqa. They want to send the FSA, the Free Syria Army forces, which is a loose and not fully coherent conglomeration of various anti-Assadist forces, including some which are, or even close to Al-Qaeda, so like Ahrar al-Sham. So, at Al-Bab and the Euphrates Shield, they did send some forces. I think they recently revealed they sent up to 8,000 forces, but I don't think they're really talking, as I understand it, about sending their own army to Raqqa. They're talking about sending Syrian opposition forces they trained. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, let me say something about Astana, but first let me go back to Barbara's question, because what I omitted was in terms of one very specific human rights issue. There is an American pastor who has been incarcerated in Turkey since October, and we did raise his case and ask that the Turkish government expeditiously return him to the United States. In terms of Astana, and I guess the only thing I would add on Russia, Iran, the Middle East, is they share a client state in the Assad regime in Damascus, which is unfortunate. And that gets to the Astana process and our confidence in that. And I should say, first of all, we weren't excluded from it. We were invited to participate, and we chose to go at an observer level. At the last round, we were represented by our acting Assistant Secretary of State for Middle East Affairs, who is one of our most competent diplomats. We hope that the de-escalation zone arrangements that are foreseen through the Astana talks are actually successful. We're skeptical. Our concern is that for this to work, Russia needs to compel the regime to stand down and stop bombing humanitarian convoys and civilian populations. And so far, they've proven either unwilling or unable to do so. The other complicating factor that makes us skeptical is the participation of the Iranians, who we do not believe are a good faith actor in this effort.
I noticed Trump said yesterday that that the U.S. supports any effort to reduce violence in Syria. Should that be understood as sort of an implicit endorsement of these de-escalation zone initiatives? And
I wouldn't want to
you don't want to
interpret
characterize the president's
words
remarks.
I would just say we hope that they succeed. We view this with some caution and skepticism.
Okay, one final round of questions. Let's take one question there. Another here.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to APEC. And my question's slightly off topic, but I'm still interested in what got Erdogan, after a long period of silence with regard to Israel, and after the reconciliation, to suddenly have this outburst against Israel on Jerusalem, and is it related to domestic politics? What's going on? Why did it suddenly happen? Thank you.
Okay, there's another question here.
Hi, Deniz Yüksel from TÜSİAD. My question is about the Reza Zarrab case, which is getting more and more complicated every day, and there are rumors going around that it could implicate members of Erdogan's family or even Erdogan himself. And I was just wondering if you think that this is on his agenda. Do you think that he brought it up yesterday? And do you think this could be a source of potential leverage over Erdogan? And basically, how do you see it affecting the relationship in the future?
Who would like to weigh in on the Israel question?
I'm happy to go for
On
it.
these?
Do you want me to do it?
I've done a lot of talking. But, yeah. Well, look, I don't think anyone who's followed this issue could be too shocked, or over a number of years could be too shocked by that outburst. It's true, since the normalization, we hadn't heard much, including perhaps the silence that was most striking, perhaps silence could be striking, was that Israel was not blamed for the coup. And that was, one of the few things Israel's not been blamed for in Turkey for a long time. Now, I think the reason for that actually was that it followed so soon after the normalization that it would have, I think, been unseemly on Erdogan's part. It would have looked like a huge error had he blamed Israel for this. But look, Erdogan sees himself as a leader, or the leader, of the Sunni world. So I think he feels when he is in a forum like this Jerusalem conference, he has to make strong statements. I worry more, to be honest, about, look, this offended Israel. Israel responded rhetorically. I worry more about Gaza. Turkey continues to have a relationship with Hamas, which it has had since early in 2006. Israel urged it to break the relationship during the normalization talks, but it agreed that there would be no terrorist operations planned from Turkey and that certain individuals would be expelled, but that they would not break the relationship, and Israel ultimately accepted that. But what's going to happen if another war breaks out between Israel and Gaza? What happens when the rockets start falling again in Israel and Israel feels it has to respond? Many analysts, I don't know your feeling on it, many Middle East analysts feel this is just a matter of time. And I think almost inevitably there is going to be a far more problematic response from Turkey, certainly rhetorically. And I think that's really what puts, what to me makes the Israel-Turkey relationship fragile, much more than this outburst about Jerusalem.
Naz, you have something to add? Or?
I think Alan kind of went into it a lot better than I would have. But the one thing on the Israel question, I just think that this visit for Erdogan didn't really produce the deliverables that he necessarily needed. So there is definitely a need to kind of come back with something. And the Jerusalem issue has been even like domestically up for debate. And recently there have been discussions how that's somewhat, even though the White House press briefing has said that Donald Trump hasn't made a decision on that, but there have been murmurs that moving the embassy and all these things are no longer necessarily on the table. So I think that this might just be some low-hanging fruit that Erdogan can bring back to his constituency, maybe a package of things, and this could be included. So that's why you probably kind of heard it appear, because even in the Turkish press, I actually saw some of that mentioned in there.
And there was, Nick, do you have something to add?
Oh, I was going to answer the question on Zarab.
Yes.
So what always struck me on the Zarab case, it seemed that any revelations about the AKP or even Erdogan's involvement in corruption that emerged in the Zarab trial would be very manageable for Erdogan, given his control of the media. Erdogan, who I assume knows better than I do, seems to feel otherwise and does seem very concerned about this case. It was reported amidst all the scuffle outside the ambassador's residence that Reza Zarrab's personal lawyer was also there to meet with Turkish officials. This is something that the Turkish government's been clearly following very carefully. I think given that they realize at some level the extradition of Fethullah Gülen is going to be very difficult, given the constraints of the U.S. legal system, they're probably correct in assuming that for Trump to intervene and somehow make sure the Zarrab case doesn't go to trial would be a little easier than getting Gülen out of the country. My only other thought is that I think the Turkish government's lobbying efforts, both with regards to Gülen through Flynn and now on the Zarrab case through Rudy Giuliani, risk backfiring very badly. The revelation drags these cases, which weren't necessarily of a huge concern to the American public, into a growing domestic political controversy. And as tensions between President Trump and the United States judicial system writ large seem to escalate, if the narrative emerges that in trying to either get Gülen out of the country or undermine the case against Zarrab, this is presented as Trump interfering with the independence of the U.S. judicial system on behalf of a foreign autocrat, that's going to produce a very serious political backlash in the United States.
And maybe just to bring the conversation full circle, I wouldn't be surprised if from Erdogan's point of view, an end to the Zarrab prosecution could be a worthy trade-off in terms of the YPG, because I think we know that since December 13th, when the corruption charges first emerged against Erdogan, this has been lurking in the background of almost everything he has done. His fear that if he loses power, that somehow these corruption allegations will engulf him. And I think we see it's a matter of almost an obsession with it.
And there is a journalist accompanying Erdogan yesterday on his trip was reporting that there is still some expectation that the new FBI director might take a different approach with the Rıza Zarrab case and the extradition of Mr. Gülen. So I would like to end the panel on that happy note. And please join me in thanking our panelists. This was a great discussion. Thank you all. Well, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and I'll give you my card.
Sorry, I ran out of time.